unless we want to get started now. But
Yeah.
the
I
you know,
just want to say
yeah,
in the chat, we have a lot of different people who are coming to us
that's
from a
right.
variety of different places. We have Katie from San Francisco. We have Sonia from Germany, who now lives in London. We have Kathleen from Mexico. Um, we have Vicky from Syracuse, New York, but originally from the UK. And we have Eileen from West Sussex in England. We've got Brad from West Virginia. And we've got Sandra from Ilkley, which is in Yorkshire. Yorkshire, United Kingdom. So we've got people from a wide number of different
Yeah,
countries, a lot of different a lot of different backgrounds that are coming to this, which is really fantastic.
exactly. So you want to get going because you love your sevens,
I love my
which
seven, so let's
I
do
will
it.
have to ask you one day what all that means. I mean, I get it, but it's just kind
No,
of
no, no.
funny
It
because
just gives people,
yeah.
7 minutes, to get in. All right.
Oh, and last thing, we have Caroline, who's fantastic because she was posted in the Netherlands for the USDA, the Foreign Service, and she was on prior presentations before. And we really and unless you want to do the public service announcement, Richard, around getting people
Oh no,
involved,
I have
yeah.
it. So,
Okay, good.
all right. So for those who are unfamiliar and for those who would like to become more familiar, here are the rules. The first thing is that this is not an academic presentation. As much accreditation as Aaron and I have, we are not professors who teach the history of the European Union or European Union institutions. We're just lay people who find this incredibly interesting. And to that end, it's going to be a secular presentation. It's going to try and stick to objective historical facts as far as that is possible in the age of fake media. But we're going to try and concretize these things and come from a neutral vantage point. Um, as with all topics, let's be respectful. But as Aaron was pointing out, we love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications are always welcome. If you want to interject vocally, please do. If you prefer to put your words in the chat, please do that as well. I read the chats and I will occasionally bring the chat into the conversation that Aaron and I are having. So either way you feel like putting in either a comment or a question, please do so. We enjoy that tremendously. The class will be hopefully a 101 and a 201, although I don't know what a 101 European Union looks like. And what I mean by this is that if you don't know anything, I'll try and catch you up on the basics. And if you know something, hopefully Aaron and I will tell you something that you didn't know before.
Or you could tell us, given that I think everyone's always stuck in the basics when it comes to the EU institutional structures. So.
Absolutely.
Oh, and one other quick thing: don't feel the need to raise your hand. We might change that if we get to like 90 people, but if at this point you can just sort of jump in with your question, just because we're going to be context switching so much. So,
absolutely. I have one of the rules that I wanted to sort of implement is a 2-hour hard stop, which means that whatever information we haven't gotten to by the end of 2 hours, that's where we're going to stop. And then we'll pick it up next month, right? Because this is a series. So don't worry. You know that at the end of 2 hours, you can leave. No hard feelings. Of course, you can always leave earlier if need requires it. But
PayPal payments would be greatly desired. No, I'm joking.
Yeah. And finally, this is recorded just like the previous one in the series. This is the second in this series that we're going to do once a month. The third one is already up on Zach's meetup group. If you want, we can provide the link to that in the chat. If you want, we can provide the link to that in the chat. So that way you can look forward to hearing us again if you think we're not boring enough. So last time
EU humor. We're trying to get you going with the EU humor. There we go.
So last time we talked about the complexity of the European Union, right? That you've got a lot of different European organizations that are working together in terms of bringing different countries together and what their modus operandi is and what their institutional mandates are, right? And even if we look at countries that are considered European Union countries, those countries that on this map that are either brown or green or purple or blue, even then we have a large variety of differences in terms of which agreements they have acceded to, which agreements they haven't acceded to. And so you have, for example, this map, which just compares the Schengen, European Union, and Eurozones. and shows that there's a lot of different ways, quote, to be European in this sort of situation. And the reason it happened was that the European Union was built piecemeal through a number of different treaties that occurred over time, right? And we also had the growth of the European Union as more and more countries became interested in the economic and supranational project that the European Union was. So the first of those treaties really was the Treaty of Paris of 18 April 1951, right? That created the European Coal and Steel Community that brought together Germany, Italy, France, and the Benelux countries to regulate just coal and steel, right? The primary artificers of war, in order to prevent war from breaking out between those powers again. And that was expanded in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome. And we discussed how the Treaty of Rome created, in addition to the ECSC, which already existed, it created the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community. Both of those treaties being the Treaty of Rome, which created the EEC, and the Euratom Treaty, which created Euratom, both being signed in 1957. With the goal being the eventual creation of a single market, right? This is the first time that we really see this idea that there will be a unitary market between the European states, and there should be an attempt to work together to limit national boundaries and regulations. So by the end of the first decade or so post-war, or 2 decades post-war, we begin to have this European integration idea, and this European integration idea follows 3 major trajectories of development. And we're going to see more of that today, right? The first one is that you have the accession of more member states, right? The widening effect. We have the transfer of more powers and decisions to the European institutions, meaning it's deepening. The European Union is acquiring more competencies, or whatever the European Union predecessor organization was, it's acquiring more competencies. And we have many more in overlapping regional arrangements, right? Differentiated integration, meaning that we have different ways that the European Union can affect national laws, and different relationships between the national laws that exist, the multi-state treaties that we've seen before, and the European Union, right? You have all these different treaty organizations that were epitomized by that map we just saw with the multiple colors. We also talked about the development of Schengen, this idea that the borders should be slowly but surely removed between the European Union member states through an organization of police and surveillance structures. And you can see by this map that the Schengen Agreement grew very rapidly, right? Within 2 decades of its initial formulation, all of the current, actually 1.5 decades of its creation, all the current members were already part of it. Right. So you have this massive area where the borders basically came down. This is a massive change in both security economy and the security situation, and also the economy, because now you have a much easier facilitation of trade when you don't have borders and customs arrangements.
And it's a very interesting thing. This is a sort of a partial side note, is if you can remember watching any movies from the 60s and 70s and 80s, or into the 80s, you can remember seeing all those sort of extra steps in security and passport control, and so it's kind of funny if you ever go back and watch one of those movies and you see people sort of traveling and those sort of steps, which, obviously anyone that's a member of any of these countries, couldn't imagine that world. And if you grew up in the last 20, 30 years, that seems sort of like some weird, alien world. And so it's just something to kind of pay attention to if you ever watch.
Absolutely. I'm probably going to date myself, but I was watching one of those older James Bond movies where they're trying to get out of Hungary and cross the border into Austria. And of course, when I went to Hungary and Austria for the first time, there was no border control. Like,
no, you literally it's like you're just going down the street, Yeah, exactly.
So I was kind of surprised by how difficult it was, but of course you have to remember the historical context of the Iron Curtain and everything.
Yeah.
All right. So then we moved to the 90s, when we have the first real formulations of what we're going to call today the European Union, right? Where you have the creation of the Copenhagen criteria, which solidified how the European Union was going to widen, right? how can you become a member of the European Union? By creating democracy, rule of law, having a functioning market economy, and agreeing to the aims of the political, economic, and monetary union that the EU stands for. And so we create this sort of organized system, but even then, what the Maastricht Treaty did is it sort of bundled all of the previous existing entities like the ECSC, like Euratom. All these things were sort of bundled together by the European Union under Maastricht. There wasn't a new European Union set of entities that were created. And so this remained more or less a patchwork of different things that had sort of been created at different points in time. So you can see sort of by this map, if you look at the part that is in the light, that is in the dark blue square, but not yet dark blue, right? You have that sort of dark blue arrow on the far right-hand side. And then before then, you have areas that are in this sort of light, dark blue shading, but are actually independently situated. These are the different entities that became part of the European Union under the Treaty of Maastricht and would not become part of the European Union core competencies until the Treaty of Lisbon, which we're going to talk about more today, right? Because that's going to be a new topic. But you can see you've got the ECSC, you've got Euratom, you've got the EEC, you've got parts of Schengen, you have coordination on police and judicial matters, you have security and foreign policy issues, and you have aspects of what was called the Western Union, which was a follow-up to the Anglo-French alliance on a military side. All right, the last thing we talked about last time was the introduction of the euro, right? One of the missions, as we've mentioned, in the European Union was to create a single monetary union. And the most effective way to create a single monetary union is with a single currency. And there were various iterative steps the European Union took in order to introduce this currency, right? The first one was to create it as an accounting maneuver and then peg all of the local regional currencies to the euro. And then eventually, in 2002, replace all of the underlying currencies with euro physical notes, change all of the bank deposits at what was already set as the pegged ratio of conversion between the local currencies and the euro, and to actually begin a euro facilitated economy. Now, most Europeans who've lived through this period point out that prices rose as soon as the single currency was implemented, which was one of the first really negative public reactions to the European Union because things began to cost more in real terms.
And one other quick piece, which we'll cover some when we get into sort of the history of the European Central Bank, is that a lot of the policy aims that came out of that period, or that learning that happened in 98, 99, 2000, 2001, where you were in essence synchronizing and synthesis and ultimately a common monetary system. A lot of those policy aims were developed to sort of deal with that after the fact, and became huge drivers to many of the policies in the post 2008, 10, 12, crises, whether it was the financial crisis in 08 or the euro crises. And so many of the governors, think of them as sort of like the policy knobs that were used, came out of that period and became very either conflicting or conflictual or restricting because they were attempting to solve something that happened, in 90, basically from the late 90s to the early 2000s.
So this is where we sort of left off yesterday, right? The Eurozone has just been implemented, and this is 2002. The European Union really embarked on its most ambitious expansionist project yet, right? We've had instances where one member joined in a year or three members joined in a year. But always when we had multiple members joining in the same year, these were countries that were either economically in the middle of the pack, or you had a case where, for example, in 1973, Britain and Denmark I believe, both joined. So you had countries that were relatively strong countries joining the European Union. And the reason I point this out is that the European Union has freedom of movement. And we haven't really discussed this at much length yet, but this is really the right time to talk about it. Any citizen of a member state of the European Union has the ability to live and work in any other member state of the European Union, which means that you have high levels of immigration between the European Union member states. When you have the majority of the European Union member states being countries like Germany and France and Italy, Austria, United Kingdom, countries with a high standard of living, you're not going to have that much migration as a general thing, because most people can subsist within their own country and don't really feel the need to travel or work somewhere else unless that particular opportunity is somewhere else, right? You don't have immigrate first to get job later as much when you have developed countries side by side. And so the major fear by incorporating Eastern Europe and Central Europe into the European Union was that these countries were not in the same economic position as the countries in Western Europe. And so the people from those countries would migrate in large numbers to Western Europe. And sort of the common propaganda campaign around this in much of Western Europe was talking about Polish people, because Poland was the largest single country of the ones that would be admitted by a significant margin. Poland has over 30 million people. Hungary, for example, has around 10 to 12 million. And so that should give you an idea about the size disparity. And so the idea was that the Polish plumbers would come to France and take away all the plumbing jobs from good French plumbers and just ruin everything. Ironically, in terms of the Polish contingent, the largest number of Poles actually went to Britain, which has resulted in them in Poles being one of the largest non-British communities in the United Kingdom,
and the UK having some of the best plumbing that I'm done.
So somehow that works out. But you have this expansion in 2004 where all of these member states are admitted at the same time, and there is some historical legal basis for that, right? You have the Treaty of Nice, which was really what after first you had the Treaty of Amsterdam, then you had the Treaty of Nice. Both of these treaties provided the legal impetus for accepting the expansion of the European Union this way, and all 10 of these countries that were expanded to were countries that had qualified under all of the Copenhagen criteria. Right, that was the huge thing, is that this was the first expansion of the European Union after the Treaty of Maastricht, when those criteria were set and the countries had to abide by them. As I mentioned last time we were together, this Polish plumber ad in France is actually from the Polish Tourism Ministry. Several years after Poland was admitted to the European Union, Poland decided to mock this theme that Polish plumbers were going to take your jobs by creating an attractive male plumber and say, visit Poland and you might find some of these plumbers, right? Because this image of a Polish plumber had been so instantiated in France that it was a fun sort of dig at that.
And one other quick thing that most people don't fully appreciate, but Poland has had the fastest continuously growing economy in the world for a country above 20 million people in the world, faster than Australia, which until COVID has basically had 30 straight years of non-recessionary growth, and to include China. So Poland's economic miracle, which really isn't talked about that way, but it really is, especially proportional to its neighbors, is a pretty big deal because it's allowed Poland to sort of, I would argue, begin sneaking up on the rest of traditional Western European economic power. And there's a I think an interesting argument that it will provide really a new center of power over the next 25 to 50 years in Europe, especially in the EU.
Interesting. So when we move from the expansionist phase of the European Union in 2004, we start to try and have European leaders attempt to concretize how the European Union is going to work and how to create institutions that are European Union institutions that replace and take over the duties of the previous entities that composed parts of the European Union. So you have this Treaty of Lisbon, and it's passed in the various member states. Now, each of the member states has to pass this treaty according to the requirements of treaty passage in their national constitutions. So some of them that's simply a legislative act in their parliaments, and others of them there's referenda. And we have two real hiccups in the attempt to pass the Treaty of Lisbon, which is why you have those 2 years there. In 2007, it was first attempted, and 2009 was when it was finally completed. So the two cases are Ireland and Poland. In Ireland, it failed a referendum before it later passed a referendum. And in Poland, there were similar voting issues. So you can imagine how excited they were on the 9th of October, 2009, when Poland was the last European Union state, that actually signed the agreement. And you can see there Lech Kaczynski, who's the president of Poland at the time, with the signed document. Now, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see this sort of diagram of the European Union, where you had the European Community, the police and judicial actions, and the common foreign policy and security being unified in the European Union's functioning organs. So as opposed to those things being independent, as we saw before, they are now merged into the duties and processes of the European Union. At the same time, the Treaty of Lisbon really set out for the first time the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is effectively the European Union's answer to the American Bill of Rights, right? That every European Union citizen has certain liberties and freedoms, the freedom of expression, the freedom of movement, the freedom from search and seizure, all of these kinds of things. One of the important things to note, though, about the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights is that in many cases it includes commentaries or limitations on those rights that on the American side have come from case law, right? So, for example, you'll have Article 10 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that will say that freedom of speech exists in the European Union, and then there's a second article, there's the section B that says, for example, that freedom of speech does not entitle everybody to be able to broadcast on national media. So you have these kinds of limitations on the rights already built into the EU Charter.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a very interesting dynamic. You could almost argue there is a sort of macro legal set of let's call them human values driven rights, which are sort of directional, and then there's a very highly regulated approach to those individual rights, and it is very driven from the institutions to the population versus the population to the institutions. So there isn't that big sort of Hobbesian, Lockean handoff in the traditional form of diffusive rights, which you usually get when you get sort of bill of independent rights as individuals.
Yeah, I'd like to drill down on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Right, because when we think of bills of rights, these are things that is a popular conception. This is the people approaching the government and saying, the government, you have been in excess of a variety of things, right? You've limited our ability to speak. You've invaded our homes without our permission. These are the things that you have to promise us that you will not do, right? It's primarily instigated by the people towards their government. And the point that you're making here is that this is exactly the opposite. This is the government choosing to limit itself according to specific norms and historical conduct. So these are rights to protect the people imposed by the government themselves on themselves.
Exactly. And where this gets tricky is that in Europe, there's a handful of states that basically didn't get fully reconstructed after 1945. And so they have a lineage, France being one, obviously going back to the Napoleonic laws, the UK while it was in the EU. But there's a whole bunch of states that, in essence, sort of started off on, if I'm going to use an American sports analogy, baseball, which most people won't know about, but whatever, I think everyone knows the concept of the diamond. Many started off on second base because they reconstructed their legal architecture in the post-World War II era. And they didn't have all of that administrative law all the way down to the local level, right? And that really matters, right? It's not just a conceptual thing at a nationalized or federalized level. It's living law, as it's called. And so it was a lot easier to sort of have a clean sheet in 1940s and by the early 50s around what different regulatory behaviors around individual rights were in these newly constructed legal states. Whereas if it was in France or if it was in the UK or even parts of Italy, which were basically sub-states, you're not going to go in and just sort of flatten individual localized administrative rights, because it gets into some pretty hairy territory when it comes to property rights and law, contracts. I mean, trusts, agreements, inheritances. I mean, it's not just sort of theoretical anymore. And there is this sort of almost strangely two-tracked world, and they keep trying to sort of super glue them together sometimes, and then let them be sort of near each other. And sometimes if they're a little too close, they spark, and so I think that's something to always be aware of whenever there is a new legal values-driven norm that they're attempting to implement from the European Union, Commission, Parliament,
right,
Council,
no,
ministers,
we're going to discuss that next time when we get to proportionality and subsidiarity.
That's right.
Okay. So anyway, so this Treaty of Lisbon comes into existence, defines the major institutions of the European Union, which, by the way, we're going to discuss later today, right? And then we sort of move after the Treaty of Lisbon to the European Union having to deal with current national issues or issues that affect multiple nations and how those nations perceive the European Union, right? You've got the Eurozone debt crisis, which of course is clearly connected to the way the European Union is financially solvent or insolvent. You have the EU migrant crisis, which is related to questions about security and borders, which of course would have been addressed under the Schengen Convention, which has now folded into the European Union in a certain way, as well as refugee conventions that are certainly part of European Union regulations, and Brexit, which is of course Britain choosing to leave the European Union for a variety of localized reasons. Now, we're not going to address the specifics of most of these crises today. In fact, I think the plan is eventually to address them one by one as we sort of move through European Union history, because it really matters to understand the institutions in order to understand the way that they're reflecting and refracting European public opinion on these crises while they're happening. All right. So we've got several questions about Europe, right? So we need to sort of understand this concept of the diminution of the national identity, right? You've got these political considerations on a national level by people who are very much prone to seeing themselves as part of a national conception, not as a European conception. And so you have to balance these economic desires for further integration with a political resistance in a certain way to that integration. And that's been one of the key issues that the European Union has had to face. And it showed up in all three of the crises that we just pointed out. We also see that while freedom of movement and the common market has been extremely successful from an economic perspective on Europe writ large, many of these things have either impoverished certain areas of the European Union or have been perceived to have effects on individuals in parts of Europe that are at least numerically improving. A good example of the former is, for example, Slovenia. Slovenia during the Yugoslav days was the industrial heartland of Yugoslavia. But when Slovenia became integrated into the common market, a lot of the jobs in the industrial sector moved to Italy, moved to Austria. And so many Slovenians were unable to maintain their factories because they didn't produce goods at the same level of low cost that they could in Italy or in Austria because of factors of scale, right? So you see a lot of antagonism towards this idea of the common market coming from places where the common market has led to a localized diminution of economic viability. On the flip side,
a quick thing, and what you see is the lack of European institutions down to the regional level, which allows for let's say a more incorporative or integrated European diffusion, especially not just economically, but that's a big one, but politically and socially. So in that example of Slovenia and Italy, which if you've ever been to northeastern Italy, it just sort of fuses over the border there, which is a really beautiful area. I mean, that the Slovenian area is amazing. And that's a region, you almost want to think of it in, if you have any other familiarity with other parts of Europe or the US or that it's sort of like an incorporative region that crosses several states, that because of where people live and can live and the ease of transportation should be able to basically co-develop, right? So if you think of an area like in the far northwest United States, Seattle and Vancouver, they have, while not fully integrated, I mean 100%, they have a extremely dynamically, I'd say semi-integrated regional economy, what is called an economic sort of a mega region. And you don't really have that layer in the EU institutionally. And ultimately, it's the gap between the sort of it's like this hard cutoff of the national and the supranational, which is the EU wide. And there isn't this sort of middle level of governance, and which I argue, and I think many would, creates a lot of friction that doesn't really have to exist, because the dollars are there, or a lot of them, to allocate, but they ultimately kind of go down the national bucket, and there's nothing for that regional side. And you see this in what's called the banana, which is that whole coastal region, really from Genoa all the way across through past Barcelona, and that there is not a regional institution for that, even though anyone that lives in those regions, that's sort of like on the West Coast of the United States, what's called PCH, Pacific Coast Highway. I mean, it's sort of like that. And people do navigate that in the way they live, the way they have their families, the way people move, the way businesses operate, et cetera. But there isn't that institutional layer. And so there's a negative investment, really, and not just economically, but politically,
right,
socially, culturally. And then that just generates enormous regional and national frictions. And I argue that is a massive gap that has to get confronted, or else you're going to have this sort of almost two-track. I argue you already have a two-track, maybe eventually three-track EU, right. Which I think gets very unhealthy.
Right. I mean, I think you see something very similar happening in the United States, where we do have a common market and free movement, which is that you have a hollowing out of the interior of the country,
That's
right?
right.
You have people flocking to the major cities, and even though the federal tax dollars would be more than adequate to rebuild these communities in a certain way,
Yeah.
right, to either to bring industry there or to create new federal grants or things like the TVA had been in the
Yeah.
1930s, right? You could create industry in those areas. We're not seeing that, and so it's creating a lot of friction in the United States between those who live in the major cities and therefore see the sky as the limit, and those who live elsewhere in the United States.
And the only bridge you have in the US basically are the land grant super universities. So if it's
yeah,
Columbus, like Columbus is really sort of a secret, mega subregion, right? Columbus, Ohio, because of Ohio State and all of the ancillary kind of things that come off of it. And so if you have one of those super colleges, universities in your state, that's sort of this survival bridge. But if you don't have that and you don't have one of those cities, well, there's a massive deindustrialization, and there's really no political or social or economic drivers to try to change that. And the truth is, Europe, to be honest, doesn't have to go down that path. They really don't. But and I think Richard also agrees. I argue if they don't step in, these things are going to happen. I mean, they're already happening, basically.
The other thing that I wanted to address, and I had sort of brought it up earlier, is when you have this freedom of movement leading to a large number of people in an area that is economically doing well. I like to use the example of London when the UK was part of the European Union here, right? You have this large number of migrants, relatively speaking, from places in the European Union that are much less wealthy, places like Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and they create a lot of pressure on low-skilled jobs in the United Kingdom, which allows employers to keep wages low even as inflation rises, right? So you have this secondary issue of the freedom of movement. Yes, it's very empowering to the people in those poor countries. They can seek jobs and lives elsewhere in the European Union, and even for people in wealthy countries, it's very empowering in that they can take job opportunities in other countries where their skill set might be better used. But at the same time, it does create a lot of pressure, especially when we're talking about low skilled jobs in very well compensated markets. And so it creates another level of friction where within one national schema, you have the people in the middle and upper middle classes, they're seeing their wages grow, develop, and change, and the people in the lowest classes not seeing that growth and development, which creates this sort of 99%er mentality.
Yeah. And I would say two key pieces to this that were really never, I don't want to say never, people are smart, that were not prioritized, is that you have a brain drain in many of these places of either the most professionally or technically talented people, or what you'd almost call the entrepreneurial or the hustling population. So you will leave a region with maybe a quarter or a third less people, but maybe 80-90% of the most able people to contribute to your economic growth. And then when you add on top of it, because that happens, if you're young and you don't have those people there, and so that means you don't have a lot of opportunities or as many getting created, then the young people leave. And a great example of this is Bulgaria, right? Bulgaria is it's the
punching bag.
It's the punching bag for this, which is sad. And the EU just sits there and it's just sort of like, oh, well, I guess it's supposed to be this way, right? And you've had very similar policies like that in the United States or in Canada, I would argue the same way, or Australia. So this is something that is not, there's no sort of national magical dimension to this. I'd say the second piece that's really important is that, and I would argue a feature versus bug discussion, is that when they emancipated people, because I really do view it that way, for the freedom of movement, you did not have a fiscal integration, which is sort of this dark side to the whole EU project, really going back,
Right.
quarter plus century. And the reason that's important is that if you don't have a transmission mechanism to continuously reinvest or to create opportunity for investment, then guess what happens? People can leave, and there's nothing coming in there to pick up the opportunity, because when obviously when supply leaves, demand changes, prices fall, so that represents some economic opportunity. And where this is a real tangible, like real world kind of example is if you look at the Greek crisis a decade ago, there was not a mechanism, and I'm not arguing that even if there was a political will, but that's a separate discussion. There was not a mechanism for German pension funds to be able to go into Greece and make concrete investments. I mean, real world investments in industry, real estate, development, et cetera, which I argue would have led to a resurgence economically. And, you know, that talent that leaves starts to say, oh, wow, there's a lot going on back home. You know, maybe I'll start a second business there, or maybe I'll buy a piece of property or whatever. And you get this more balancing going on. And that is fundamentally, that does not exist. And so as each of the smaller states runs into these, I call them limits crisis, right? Debt to GDP, right? These sort of artificial crises that are generated. They're almost generated by the large states. And then the large states have no fiscal or political driver to help them out, which then creates this vicious cycle. It's almost like people are cutting their own feet off.
Aaron, we actually have a question in the comments.
Oh, please.
When somebody uses freedom of movement, can they get health insurance in the new country that they move to?
Yes, they can. And so, so we're assuming somebody leave. So, you know, the different personas, right? So assuming a working able-bodied person leaves, gets a job, a job and healthcare relationship isn't attached across almost all of the EU, but basically it's not. And so that person obviously has healthcare. A person leaves and moves somewhere, and let's say they're a student, or let's say they're an older couple, et cetera. They will obviously register that they're in that new jurisdiction, and there is think of it as sort of like it's kind of a clunky cost sharing that goes on, but it's priced proportionally from the home country. So let's say an older Hungarian couple left, or a Bulgarian couple left, and they move to Greece, or they move to Spain. There would be this, think of it as a small little check that would come from the Hungarian side to the Spanish, but ultimately Spanish taxpayers, VAT paying taxpayers, are going to be financing that couple's healthcare on the whole. And obviously that couple is spending their euros in Spain, so they'll be financing it also. So now where that does not fully happen, unless you, and there's different contribution schemes. So this goes back to the fiscal problem. It's really a mess when it comes to this, but pension scheme sharing is sort of like the line in the sand, right? So people can't really arbitrage the highest paying pension countries unless you went to that country, worked enough as each country sets those guidelines, and then you can acquire usually the minimum amount of pension that country generates. And some cases like the Netherlands or France, you know, are pretty rigorous about how they enforce that. And other places like Denmark, or I'm sorry, not Denmark, I meant Germany and Belgium are, let's say, a little more flexible. And obviously Belgium is like the Washington, D.C. of Europe. They have a lot of sort of exogenous financial benefits of being Brussels. So they get some extra, you know, basically money in the coffers to sort of run the place. And so that benefits them.
Another thing I would add to that answer is that in many cases, because of the cost sharing mechanism, a person who travels from country A to country B will not get all of the benefits of country B's healthcare system. They may have different copays. They may
That's
have
right.
different access to different kinds of surgery, things like
Yep.
that. So
Yep.
they're treated not exactly the same as a citizen of the country. And a point that you made that I just want to make clear is that in most European countries, healthcare is either nationalized, quasi-nationalized, or privatized, but privatized without connection to business.
That's right.
So your job does not make, your healthcare is not contingent on you having a job. It is
That's right.
contingent on your residency in the country.
Yeah. And so what to be honest, a lot of what happens, and there is a sort of, you know, lots of little microservices, like basically companies that help you do this, is that you'll get a couple, let's say a upper middle class couple from an Eastern European or Central European country that will move. They still have some working years left. So maybe late 50s, early 60s. And they will move to a different, you know, usually climate driven. They want to, you know, live in Spain, Greece, Portugal, whatever, which I would too. And what they do is they basically work enough that they sort of, I don't want to say buy their way up the ladder, but it's ultimately kind of a version of that. And they can meet all of those contribution, time and service, or enough of them, and sort of schematic requirements, and they get really close to being, you know, let's just say middle of the road, sort of a retiree when it comes to things like healthcare. They more often than not, unless they really did work, let's say 10 years, they won't get the retirement, you know, the sort of national pension. That won't come close. That's a piece that is still extremely well regulated, because I think they do know if they open season on that, that would just be, I mean, that would be a financial catastrophe across Europe, right? It just would,
exactly. You could imagine
fall apart.
everybody moving to whichever country has the best pensions and just
until that country cuts their pension because they can't afford it. Then you go to the next one, right? And so
Exactly.
yeah. So
all right.
exactly.
So anyway,
great question. If there's any others on this, please.
Always submit your questions. We're more than happy to talk about them. And it looks like we have another question in the chat. Oh, thank you. So we're now shifting from the historical discussion of how did the European Union come into existence, to the question of, when we say the European Union, what are we actually talking about? Like what if I went to DC, right, to see the United States government, there's the House of Representatives, there's the Senate, there's the presidency, there's the executive committees, but you have a fairly clear sense of what the Supreme Court, you have a fairly clear sense, though, of what the government is. And in the European Union, that's a lot foggier for people. So we're going to try as best as we can to demystify that, which is going to be quite an errand. So we've got three different aspects of European governance that are the core characteristics that we should focus on, right? The first one is that it's got this super state structure. We've talked about this before, right? You got this intergovernmental control where the governments of different member states are working together. You have supranationalism, where you have top-down organization of all the European member states by the institutions of the European Union. And so you have this very strong interplay between the independence of the nation states, and therefore they're working together, and this sort of top-down mandate. So some of the organizations and institutions we're going to see are appointed by the member states to represent the member state interest, right? That's that intergovernmentalism aspect of this. And there are some that have a European Union-wide vision, and so they are not directly loyal to the countries from which they come. The next aspect is that you've got multiple levels of governance depending on the policy that we're trying to implement. So there are some things like, for example, national borders or fisheries that are governed at an EU level and almost exclusively at an EU level. And then you've got situations where increasingly it's held at a national level, and the European Union has to sort of bridge the gap between how much control they wish to have at a certain level, and then the national governments pick it up, and there's always this tug of war, especially when we're talking about very very touchy subjects, like, for example, criminal law, right? Then we have questions of democratic legitimacy, and this is something that we're definitely going to touch on more throughout this conversation. But most of the institutions of the European Union are not appointed by the citizenry through a vote or through a referendum or something that the majority of European Union member citizens in whatever the relevant jurisdiction is, they're not voting on this. They're not choosing this. These are either indirectly appointed people, in the sense that an elected leader at the national level is appointing a European Union leader, or they are entirely without public accountability, right? So we have this deficit of democracy in the European Union, and it leads to a large amount of Euroscepticism.
And it also, one other quick point that we'll be bringing up as we go through the different crises that we've picked so far, and we want you all to contribute to that, right? So if there's other large ones or micro ones to discuss, and we're not trying to discuss them as EU is bad and this is good. So we're not trying to be very normative about it. We're trying to be really structural. We're trying to point out how there's an amplification challenge in many of the crises that are created because of the institutional governance that occurs. And a lot of this is sort of almost reactively backward looking, if that makes any sense, right? You had a crisis 3 years ago. We create a bunch of new institutions or procedures or protocols to stop that crisis, but nobody's looking at sort of the root cause and saying, well, I'm not forget about that crisis. We'll account for it, but it's part of a larger symptomatic pathology that's going on, and we want to address that. And so that doesn't, I mean, to be honest, that's what I'm arguing. I think that Richard is too, that there does not seem to be the will and also just the institutional capacity to create those recognitions, even when there is a large crisis. So anyways, that's a lot of why we're trying to almost pick these crises, and there's others you want to add, as sort of like little use cases or case studies that we can then sort of navigate how and why the EU governance occurs and when it doesn't, if that makes sense.
No, that's absolutely right. All right. So when we look at the core EU institutions, I put 5 of them here. We're going to talk about a 6th as well, which is the European Central Bank. But we sort of divide
today.
What?
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
Mine for today. Sorry. I have the ECB. So everyone get your pillows ready when that one comes out for napping.
So, right. So we've got basically 3 separate categories, right? We've got the legislative, executive, and judiciary, and a 4th category, which is the overarching mission, right? So you've got the European Council, and for some reason, the European Union could not figure out a way to make these names less confusing. So if you remember from last time, we had the Council of Europe, which is entirely outside of the European Union and is a European intergovernmental agency. So you've got the Council of Europe, you have the European Council, and if you look at the first of the legislative, you have the Council of the European Union. So all 3 of these, the Council of Europe, the European Council, and the Council of the European Union, entirely separate agencies, organizations, and with entirely different mandates. And we'll discuss the mandates of all these more in depth, but I'm just laying this out here. So we've got this European Council in Brussels, and the European Council, the job it has is really setting the agenda. They meet about 5 times a year, right? And their goal is to sort of decide what it is that Europe will do, right? Which way is the train running? So that's their position. Then in the legislative branch, we have 2 houses, if you want to call it that. We have the European Parliament, which is elected publicly, and we have the Council of the European Union, which is appointed ministers, and those ministers are appointed by the nation states that they represent. Both of them vote on proposals. Those proposals can be either regulations or directives. We'll get more into that next time we meet, what the difference is between a regulation and a directive. But both of those legislative branches have to review the putative legislation. You also have the European Commission, which is really their executive, but unlike the executive of most major member states, the executive is not one person, it is a commission, and it represents all of the executives of the European member states. And finally, you have the judiciary, right? You have the Court of Justice of the European Union, and this court hears cases that exist on questions of European Union laws, right? These regulations and these directives, how are they being implemented? To the extent that they're implemented poorly or irregularly by the member states, or just in terms of the actions that are being taken, but it's usually through member state failure to implement properly. It will go to this Court of Justice of the European Union, which has some aspects of nationality to it and some aspects of European supranationality to it.
And one other quick point here I want to make, which is often missed, but it's really mechanical, and I think it's really fundamental, is that if you noticed, and by the way, fantastic slide that Richard composed here, is that there's a city name next to these, or a state city name, in the case of sort of Luxembourg, which is it's state slash cities. No offense to any, and I've never gotten a clean answer on this.
It's
Are they Luxembourgians? I mean, but is that, and when we get to the ECB, the European Central Bank, that's in Frankfurt, so that's a fifth city. And so there is this, think of it as conveyor belt going on between these cities, which creates, which the goal originally, which was not a terrible goal, it made a lot of sense, especially given European history, and sort of ground truth in Europe and the way people live. They did not want to concentrate all the power in one place, with the belief that national power could be generated from it. So they created this sort of mechanism where parties will, whether every month, whether every quarter or every 2 months, right? Basically every month, 2, 3, or 4, will move around. And when I say these parties, I mean like the whole show. I mean, we're talking, it's sort of like, and they call it this, it's called a carnival. There's the Carnival of Europe, it's called, as it comes to town for their for their quarterly, week-long, or 2-week-long sessions that they'll have, or their monthly one that is, I think, usually somewhere between 2 and 4 days. And obviously all the staff and everybody else. And so sort of politically at a social level, it seems to make sense to do something like this, especially in the beginning when you build institutions, because you want there to be some sort of, you almost think of it as psychological safety from all the different member states. But once you get decades in, and the lifestyle of doing this, and let's just be very honest, like imagine you're a working parent in your 30s and 40s where you're raising your kids, and this is what you have to do on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. It's not extremely sustainable for being able to work like this. Now, COVID weirdly showed, like in a lot of other aspects of the rest of us in humanity, that somehow the world could get a lot of work done, not everything, of course, but a lot of work done virtually. And so they virtualized a lot of this, but they've quickly come back whenever they can, which speaks to that this is very important social political infrastructure for them, right? They really want these parties to come together on a regular basis, like in conference rooms for 6 hours, and get unanimity in all their voting, which we'll get to later. But that's something to recognize is this sort of funky dynamic where, I mean, you can't really point to any other large scale or even small scale Democratic or Republican type development politically. I mean, that's small d, small r. Anywhere in, I probably go back to Greece, and this is very Greek sounding, but, in the modern world where you sort of take the carnival on the road and try to engineer large scale, modern supranational politics. So it's just something to recognize, which most people miss this. I missed it for years until I heard a podcast on it from Political EU.
It's actually pretty wild because the one that it affects the most is the European Parliament, because basically once a month
absolutely
they go to Strasbourg, and that's not just the 700 plus parliamentarians going to Strasbourg. That is all of their retinue and all their documentation.
That's right.
And all of their accoutrements and everything else, right, that make an office run. So
I mean, I heard a fantastic podcast, which I'll dig up. It's from political.eu, right? There's Politico, which is US based, and there's political.eu, if you aren't familiar with it, which is fantastic news source and great podcast interviews and so on about weekly. They did a podcast maybe a year or so ago. And it was this fantastic, woman who basically spent 20 years in the EU, sort of institutions, and, got married, has kids. And she basically gave up, like, once her kids sort of hit teenage years, and just said, I can't do, like, this is insane. Like, I can't do this anymore. This is not sort of functional. And just went and became, basically just lives in Brussels and works as like an NGO, basically has a normal job and can have a normal life. And so clearly there's a friction that gets generated doing this just in people's lives. But one thing she pointed out is that when you do this long, everything starts at zero all the time. You're always starting back at zero. You're rebriefing things every month, over and over again. And people just aren't able to get to more advanced challenges because you're just forklifting, back and forth across
Aaron,
these.
We have a question actually in the comments.
Sure.
Now that the Spitzenkandidat system for electing the European Commission is dead, what sort of system do we believe should replace it?
Wow. So quick thing to kind of take a quick detour. So let's just be very honest. The first, and then there's still a bunch of these, like in the ECB, the first 50 to 70 years of this European project has been a very Franco-German political infrastructure project where, basically certain big countries are, almost guaranteed portfolios, which is basically the truth. I actually believe, and it will suck in the first few cycles, just like it has everywhere in the history of the world, but it will gain a huge legitimacy. I think there should be, you can do it proportionally. Start with electoral college, which I know people hate that, but it is a very useful intermediary mechanism. And then you work, maybe have a 10-year cycle until you open it up from there. But then you work into popular elections where you can start to have this real democratic legitimacy in electing presidential leaders. So you could do a two-step process, which I think sort of has been proven in most places to be pretty effective, because you get out of the sort of, you buy some time to get out of the sort of mass hysteria phase, and then you can, sort of educate everybody along the way, including all of the electors. And I really do believe long-term, for legitimacy reasons and for consolidation, right? Because most people don't know this. There's somewhere between, depends on your classification system, 7 to 13 presidents, right? I'll take an average number of 10 as the going rate. And so clearly there has to be some reconciliation, both democratically, administratively, bureaucratically, and in governance terms. And I think allowing for more popular executive electoral system, that would be my take. And I don't view that as sort of an American bias. I view that as sort of, this system is extremely unsustainable if you're adding, which right now, if you average, they're adding a new president about every 3.5 years. So if you just take that out, you're going to have more presidents than ministers on the Council of Ministers. Eventually you'll create the Council of Presidents, which I don't know what the hell the difference between that will be in the Council of Ministers. At a certain point, you're just going to keep replicating, virally, these administrative units. And
just to clarify, the Council of Ministers and the Council of the European Union are the same thing.
Yes. Sorry.
I actually would agree with you. Like, normally I would be opposed to creating some sort of intermediary entity like the Electoral College. But in this case, because the European Union Constitution has never been finalized, there's never been some sort of final result. The idea of constantly reinventing what the European Union is about and how it's organized seems pretty much part of the fabric of the organization. I'm less opposed to it than I would be ordinarily. I also think that you're right, that the citizenry of the European Union, number one, should have a voice in the policy that's greater than it currently is. And number two, they need to become acclimated to the process of electing a European president and understanding what that position is that they're voting for.
Yeah, and you bring up a critical point, which at some point we'll get into one of the sort of substrata or geologic drivers, is that there is not a constitutional system. And they've sort of ran away from it based on the experiences they had in the 2000s and the aughts. Very similar to the 300 odd year journey that the UK has been on without a constitutional system. And I don't think I've never believed, having that gray area in a modern democratic, Republican type forms of government is very healthy over time, because it just, everything turns to gray flux, reactive decision-making, which grinds down legitimacy. I mean, it's sort of proven, it's almost irrelevant where you are in the world. And I really do believe in the European project as one of the great projects in maybe human history, but I think they have to be willing, and those of you that are members here, step up and create the constitutional structure. And it will suck. It will take you 20 years. It took the United States 20 years almost, right? I mean, it's just these things, you're not going to get it in a nice little PowerPoint. It's going to happen over a weekend. It's going to take the time it takes. But once you create that, you have the rubric to create the next 100 years of the European project in a way that maybe nothing's ever been created in history. So, all right. Sorry, I get off my soapbox now. Sorry.
No, I think that was important. All right. So, as we mentioned, right, the European Council is about creating the overarching vision of the European Union, right? So you've got these European Council members, and so they're defining the policy objectives. They decide on institutional reforms, like the kind of reform that we were just discussing, and determine key personnel who are going to be part of European Union procedures. And as I said, this institution meets very rarely, less than once a month, and is just really there for the big headlines of this is what the European Union is going to do, and the rest of the entities will see it through.
Yeah. You bring up a very good point about, and hopefully everyone here can, whichever one of these strikes something in you, can maybe drill down a little bit on just to do it. Just, and there's enough great resources, Euronews, political.eu. I mean, there's dozens of these, EuroITV, et cetera. And within your own sort of ideas, figure out, well, which one could we, conjoin? Which one could we get rid of? Which one could we expand? And around how you think the world in the EU would benefit and governance would benefit. Because I really do think that's a lot of what we're trying to do here, is open up this space to have these conversations, because it doesn't seem like, to be honest, there's a lot of spaces that people have these conversations. They're either all in on everything they do is Goldilocks and magic, or it's the worst thing since, I don't know, the Mongols. I have to bring them in, but and obviously it's neither. There's this hard work that has to get done, and the only way people can do it is for citizenry to understand what the work is, and that's I think a lot of our passion behind this, to be honest.
So after we leave the European Council, right, we move into the organizations that are legislative, right? We've got the Council of the European Union. This is the upper house, if you want to call it that, although it's not technically defined as such. It's functionally the upper house of the European Union legislative branch. And each state is allowed one minister. And there's a president of the council, and that president rotates every 6 months. Now, all binding EU laws must come through the Council of the European Union as a legislative body. It's not the only body it needs to go through, but it must go through them. They also monitor the Commission, which we're going to talk about soon, which is the executive entity. And their style of voting is that they either have to decide something unanimously or per qualified majority. And what that means is that the different member states have different amounts of votes contingent on their population. So even though it's only one human, that one human from Germany in a qualified majority vote has significantly more voting power than that one human who comes from Malta.
Yeah. And to be honest, this is arguably by a mile the most undemocratic institution in the EU, because of the way it concentrates basically national power. And to Mark's earlier question about sort of replacing the system of, let's say, pre-allocated power, you could make a very fair argument that a version of that is going on in the council as the big national leaders get teed up. Right now, it's Macron, who is basically the president. And then, of course, his people have been working a year to build a Superman portfolio, so that he could come in his 6 months, and obviously it times well with the French elections and so on, which, to be blunt, has very questionable purpose in advancing, European sort of policy aims and governments. It's sort of this weird randomness that happens when the super leaders come in, as I call them. And what you find is when you get one from Slovakia or from, like a much smaller state, they sort of act, let's just be honest, more normal, like in terms of politics and sort of operations. I would almost argue it would never happen. You would get rid of the large state leaders as a European Council presidency, because they so steer the council to their needs domestically when it comes to their politics. And I would ask all of you for the next, I guess 5.5 months or whatever it is, follow this a little bit and take your own opinion on that. That's just my take on it.
So how do you feel, Aaron, that this brushes up against the mission of the European Council that we just discussed, right? The European Council is trying to create a formula for how the European Union should proceed and what its objectives should be. How does that fight with or work alongside with the presidency of the Council of the European Union being from let's say a large, powerful country and instituting?
Well, what I would say is, and I know people will have a lot of sort of short-term opinions, many valid, many, I think, probably more hyperbolic, of the last 5 or 10 years in the United States in terms of our governance and I would say the strength of our legislative and our constitutional system. But I think overall our system ultimately is fairly stable in terms of, when you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. Imagine there was an Article 4, which is the governors. Now, and I know Richard's getting a kick out of this because he would know what it would mean legally. Now, the governors are the fourth branch, or in this case, they'd probably be the second branch, actually, in our system. If they did this, right, the first branch would be the legislative, the second would be the governors, the third would be the executive, and the fourth would be the judicial. Imagine that world in the United States. That is, I argue, a very similar parallel to what the Council of European Union is. And you know what? I give people wide latitude when they develop new institutions. I always have, because I've been part of different institutions, private and some public. And I get when you sort of generate something in the first few years, I mean, nothing works, right? You have to put it together. You got to make decisions. But usually you try to get to a time clock. You try to say the first 10 years, we're going to be like this, then we're going to renew. So my belief always was this fit a period of European Union political infrastructure development. It made a lot of sense for a period, but it's outlived itself. And my sense is you wouldn't want a bunch of governors. And by the way, I would take this to any country too. You know, take whatever country your background's from, whatever a governor or provincial leader is, et cetera. You don't want them, in essence, enmeshed in your national political, legislative and executive and judicial legal infrastructure, because now they're living in this sort of parallel universe where they have a certain set of power that is sort of supranational within their state relative to what they're elected to. And I think that just creates enormous confusion and friction. And so anyways, to me, that's my take on the council. It should be consolidated, basically. And you could create a much more, I'd say, adult. I mean, I think one vote, one nation when it comes to big decisions, which they do sort of have, which is weird too. When you get to the ministry level, you will get certain decisions that are treated in the one vote, one nation way. But then there's others that aren't. And I think you just have to get rid of a lot of these things and assume that people who are at this supranational level are truly committed to the European project consistently over generations, and treat them that way. Because imagine if it's the United States or some other country, if your senators or governors got to club together all of your votes from your state or province, and then you could sort of dump them on an issue and maybe cut 3 or 4 deals, and you can sort of run over the larger policy aims. And I would argue that is happening all the time. In these structures. So we've addressed the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers. We have the other legislative branch, right, which is the European Parliament. And the European Parliament is probably the biggest European institution. It has 751 members. And the interesting thing is that these 751 members are organized not by the member states whence they come. They're organized by their political affiliation. And these political affiliations exist across different member states. So you'll have a socialist coalition, you'll have a far-right coalition. These coalitions will have specific names, and different parties that operate in different parts of Europe will all join these different coalitions and sit with their coalition members more than they do with the members of their states. Now, while the Council of the European Union has to review everything in all of the different areas of discretion the Commission, that the European Union, the kinds of laws the European Union puts forward, the Parliament needs to review most of them. There are some cases where it doesn't, and unlike the Council of Ministers, which requires this qualified majority vote at the minimum, if not unanimity, the European Parliament votes by simple majority. And as you would expect, the European Parliament is allocated by population to a certain extent. Every state has a minimum of 6 members, but beyond those 6, it's based on population. So countries like Germany have 90-something members, and countries like Malta have 6. And I think one thing that's important to recognize here is that clearly this is a incredibly powerful institution that's been developed that has a lot of proportional rule, or at least the preposition for that. It's not, I would say, substantially leveraged, and because of this extremely regulated party control mechanism, right? So I'm sure you studied some of this when you were studying your master's in law, Richard, and just living there. Is that there's a lot of rules around lobbying and around the development of parties when it comes to how and where they can be developed and by what members. And I believe this contributes to a huge amount of apathy, right? Because if you can imagine, and I would give you a UK example or a US or anywhere else, your local city has a party. Let's just say we're in the UK. So it's the LDP of your local city. And then there's a county LDP with a different name, and they have 89% of the same policies. And then there's a national one with a different name, and they have 79% of the same policies, and they use different words for those policies too. So even when they're the same,
and it creates difficulty for the voters to track what those parties are.
And right? Humans are normal people. They're trying to take care of their families, go to work, watch a little bit of the sports, entertainment, art, whatever, and just function. They don't want to be full-time political operators just to vote in an election. And so there's this incredible amount of sort of confusion in density where it's just not necessary. And a lot of it comes down to if you have one of these supranational parties, you're not allowed to engage a local population except in this tiny little window every 5 years, or if there's some other special event that's occurring politically. Which I understand at the sort of good graces of politics and lobbying equals bad. But, we have to realize in the development of human beings and free expression and free assembly, which is where we get these words from, right? It's not some dirty lobbyist wearing a shiny suit, driving in a limousine. It's the process that we as human beings can come together in democratic and democratically Republican structures of government to basically request engagement with authority and have our day around our issue, whatever that is, or issues. And so they put a straitjacket, I would argue, on the complete political development process. It's sort of frozen in the nursery right now. And so I don't see, until you change that, how people are going to gain this understanding of what a particular party is going to do.
I think it's even a little bit worse than that.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to do the nice version.
Because you've addressed one thing, right? If I vote in my local election and the party I vote for is called the Socialist Londoners of why are we choosing London? It's probably the one
of Trafalgar,
the Socialist Liar tweakers of Dublin, and then you go at the Irish national level and it's the Democratic Party for the Liberation of Ireland, and then you go at the EU level and it's called the Social Workers Party for Irish
Freedom.
For Irish freedom, right? The connection between all those different levels is very hard to map.
And to take it a step further, it's not even Irish anymore. It's called the Gaelic Freedom, right? It's like, and there's Gaelic peoples that exist, and so you'll pick some up from Sicily and from parts of France and all over the place.
But it's not only that people can't identify the political party that would bear the most in line with the local party that they already support, but they actually don't know what the competencies of the European Parliament are.
That's right.
That they are actually voting for. So they don't understand what the election is. And I think the best comparison is if you went around the street in the United States and asked people, what are you voting for when you vote for the comptroller? What is a comptroller? What do they do, and who are the individuals in front of you? What experience does that person have that you would vote for them? And usually the answer is, I'm party affiliation X. This person has party affiliation X. I voted for them because they have party affiliation X.
They're the last person standing. So that must mean something to our party, whatever that is. So that's why I'm voting for them. There's almost a lot of trust in that system, to be honest, in that party generated system.
Right. So you have those sort of dual issues. The one is that people can't choose based on party X because they don't know what party X is. They can't correlate it to their national party. And the second one is they don't know what the position is. They don't know what European parliamentarians are actually voting on. And in fact,
and I was trying to stay away from that one because I felt that would be even more demoralizing. So
then you end up having political parties that are in the European Parliament, which are Eurosceptical parties, whose entire policy premise is not to vote.
Yep.
So you have this. So to me, it comes off as very strangely. You're voting for somebody whose entire mandate is that they won't vote,
or they have a let's say a conflictual policy. A great example, and this is happening right now in front of us. It's real. The nuclear energy and the Greens movement. Obviously, there's a special version of Greens in Germany. I would equate it to sort of Brexit level when it comes to nuclear energy. I mean, it's just boom. It's all the way out there when it comes to it. And then there is a spectrum in other Greens or in, let's say, semi-Greens throughout different parts of Europe, to the point that in places like France, because they get 70+% of their electricity from
nuclear,
about 100 reactors, I think is what they have now,
something like that.
And so they're very, I would argue, and you guys could flame me for this, but they're pretty rational about what the proportion of carbon to energy resource is, and they're making their sort of decisions that way. So in the European Parliament, there is obviously a sort of kludge of Green parties, but they can't really come together on some of these issues. And right now, this is like a big issue. And the reason it is that basically the commission is sort of at fake behind the scenes war with the new German government and the general German sort of view on this. Because they're putting a new mandate in place, which is saying that obviously nuclear energy represents one of the alternative sources relative to coal and oil, and to some degree natural gas. It's sort of like a bridging. They're identifying as bridging, which the Germans don't have a problem with that, or the German Greens don't. And so you have this funky dynamic where there's just no harmony or consistency in some very fundamental areas. And there won't be, because there's the inner populations inside these countries that have a concrete view. And so what everyone does is just punt, right? They don't sort of fight their way through this to come up with a new, let's call it European Green Party view, whatever that is, right? And if that means nuclear is now a bridging technology with a 30-year window, natural gas is 1 for 15, and nobody's happy, but at least all the parties in the tent recognize the need for the union to create a consistent policy. And so there's just no mechanism to do that at all. And there's no will to do that.
So the next unit that we're going to discuss is the European Commission, right? And so we've dealt with the council, the European Council.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, exactly, right. Try and figure out what I'm saying. We talked about the European Council, which sets the agenda items for Europeanization, for want of a better term. We've got the two legislative branches, which are the Council of the European Union, or the Council of Ministers, and the European Parliament. And now we have the one executive branch, the European Commission. So similar to the Council of Ministers, you have one commissioner per member state. And once those commissioners arrive in the commission, they're assigned a particular portfolio. And so you might have the case that the commissioner from France is responsible for trade, and another one, and the commissioner from Slovakia is responsible for fishing rights. And it could be, there are a number of complex portfolios, but each commissioner is assigned a specific portfolio. And then on top of that, there's a rotating president of the commission, who becomes the public voice of the commission. But he or she never speaks on his own views or her own views. He or she speaks on behalf of the views of the commission as a singular entity. In fact, a lot is made in order to shield the commission from the idea that they are composed of various different people with various different interests, and the commission is painted as a unitary entity. Now, it monitors the implementation of EU law, and it's also the source of initiation of EU legislation, which is somewhat interesting for most people who are familiar with Republican styles of democracy, right? In the United States and in most Republican democracies, legislation starts with the legislative branch, is passed by those legislative branches, and then moves to the executive for the final review before it's implemented by the remainder of the executive branch. This is not the case in the European Union. The legislative entities do not have the power of initiation. Only the Commission does. So the Commission sends the laws to the legislature approves them, they go back to the Commission. The Commission also oversees a few regulatory bodies. One of them that we're going to talk about is the European Central Bank. But yeah, so you have these different regulatory duties of them.
Oh, by the way, I just put in here for everyone. I doubt many of you will do this, but you can see the agenda, the meeting notes, and sort of very broad, almost press release communications. You don't get anything in the weeds. There's actually a legal structure to protect that. It's, I would argue, it's more extreme, significantly more extreme than executive privilege in the United States, because a lot of things under executive privilege, even if they are, unless they're very extreme national security, can be available in the public domain. They just can't be used, right? So they can't be used in the decision rubric or in the sort of policy rubric. They're, the courts will decide what's in, what's out, but you can at least know what a lot of it is, or almost all of it is. Whereas a lot of what goes on in the European Commission is really a black box, and they have a very robust, I would say probably one of the most robust non-disclosure agreements in the world, which is just very strange from something that is basically setting direction for 500 million people.
Yeah. No, it provides no way to understand what the particular motivations are of the various commissioners. How one of the, and I think we'll get more into this when we talk next time about the legal organization of the European Union. One of the things that we do very often in the United States when we practice law is that we look at the underlying intentions of the legislators when they were conceiving of the law, and what their goals were in terms of creating it. And very often in American legislation, there will be a preamble that says, to deal with the rising XXY problem that we're seeing, and to deal with the ABC corollary issue that results from it, we have decided to pass the Americans for Better America Act. So like you'll have this sort of preamble, you have this sort of legislative intent that you can access and use in court adjudications, that you can use in terms of providing guidance prior to courts reviewing specific infractions of the law or certain violations of the law, so to speak, that really give a sense of what the purpose is. And we really don't see that at all coming out of the commission. It's incredibly opaque. And since the commission is the initiator of the laws, we don't know in sort of a macro sense what the commission's aims are beyond what they tell us externally to those meetings, right? Whatever they say at press conferences, whatever we can glean from the choice of legislations that they send to the Parliament or to the Council of the European Union. And that gives a very limited sense of how to implement European Union law.
And to actually make a great example of this, that you could compare and contrast is the ACA, which is the Affordable Care Act, is actually not called Obamacare. That's just something that's been sort of made up in the media and developed sort of culturally. But the development of the ACA, and I mean like its underlying drivers, its rubric, how it sort of how the sausage was engineered in through the House of Representatives and ultimately the Senate, that became, or that is, the foundation that when the ACA was challenged in court, that the Supreme Court used to basically maintain it, because there was this very robust, you could almost say deterministic definition for what its aims were, and the fact that the law matched those aims and the outcomes matched the outcomes that were expected based on the aims and how the law was written. That was enough for the court system to say, yep, they have the right to pass the law. Obviously, they have this was the law they designed. This was the intent for it, and it does that. And bingo. And you're talking about pretty substantial legislation. When it comes to adjudicating the underlying purpose of what the commission wants to do, you have almost no idea of what the underlying purpose is. You have to sort of guess, almost in a weird old nobility system or era of sort of sovereign monarchs, i.e., who's the council president for that 6 months, of what their intent is. And if it gets challenged, it's one of the reasons a lot of things get sort of trapped inside the European court system, is they have to sort of fumble and stumble their way. And in some ways, to be very honest, the commission is sort of outsources a lot of that underlying intent to the European Court of Justice.
Right, which is why I thought it was an excellent lead-in.
Yes.
One point I wanted to make while we're talking about courts, to especially our American listeners, is that the American court system has two major powers, and those powers are to review lower cases, both on issues in statute, right? That's a law that somebody writes, or issues in the Constitution. And then on a separate side, it has the power of judicial review, which is an incredibly expansive power. And it allows the American courts to look at a law, declare whether it is constitutional or unconstitutional, and then itself prescribe law that fits in the hole that it thinks that it has now created. This is a power that European courts do not have. And this is a power that that almost every court on the continent would be very, very scared to implement. When court decisions are made outside of the United Kingdom and Ireland, because the system there is more similar to what we have in the United States, excluding Scotland for certain reasons. On the continent, judges typically don't have the power of judicial review, and to the extent that they can rely on previous precedent, in other cases, it's very minimal. So they really have to just sort of grind out the legislative case each time. One of the developments of the European Union court system was this hybridization between the British model, where you have some elements of judicial review and some elements of precedent, where you can use previous court cases to determine the outcome in a current court case, integrating some of that into something that's closer to a continental court system. And that's where you end up with this Court of Justice of the European Union. So one of
and one other quick point, you could almost weirdly make an analogy that there's a lot of almost administrative law that's adjudicated, or the administration of administrative law, with sort of a strange version of a general counsel attached to it. And I think there's this dynamic that which you'll see protocol and proceduralization very focused, right? The Poles did not do X, Y, or Z, or the Hungarians, or the Germans, or whatever it is. And they, to adhere to the mandate, have to do that, have to meet that. And that's very administrative, really, in many ways.
No, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about the Court of Justice of the European Union, even Europeans that I've talked to, is that the Court of Justice of the European Union is not a court of appeals from national court systems. So let's say that we have a case in the Netherlands, and Aaron and I are both Dutch citizens, and I run away with Aaron's laptop, and I start screaming at the top of my lungs. And he says, no, I have to give a European Union presentation. This is not going to work. And so he files a court case against me to get his laptop back, right? Assuming that the court case could move quickly enough so that we could be ready in a month. So he goes through all the different levels of the Dutch court system to sue me for recompense. And for whatever reason, it keeps getting appealed, whatever issues. And it goes to the highest court in the Netherlands. The highest court in the Netherlands makes its decision. And that's it. There is no possible appeal to the Court of Justice of the European Union. The issue at a fundamental level, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry about that. That was the only way I could do it.
No, no problem. The Court of Justice of the European Union only deals with European Union law, and the law that was violated in the case of me stealing Aaron's laptop was a national law of the Netherlands, right? Whatever law against theft that is. So what kind of cases end up in this court? And these are cases where laws prepared by the European Union, be they directives or regulations. In the case of directives, there are a lot of different ways that a directive can cause an issue. Regulation is pretty straightforward. But a European Union member states' violation of those requirements is what brings you before the European Court of Justice. So let's say I have a regulation from the European Union. Regulation says every wine bottle has to be 750 milliliters in terms of its size. I have a member state. Member state allows wine bottles of different sizes. Somebody sues because they say that the member state should have only allowed the regulation. The regulation has supremacy over national law. That goes to the Court of the European Union, Court of Justice of the European Union. They do not pass stop. They do not pass go. They do not file in the courts of that member state. They go straight to the CJEU. Now, in terms of how the CJEU actually processes claims, what you end up having is the following. You'll have 28 judges that exist as a bank of judges, and from that, 5 judges are randomly chosen. Typically speaking, they try to avoid having judges be the judges if one of the member states being sued in the Court of Justice is from that same country, right? To avoid that conflict of interest. But generally speaking, so you'll have these 5 judges, and each of the judges will have come from a different member state. All the 28 judges in the bank are from the various 28 member states. I guess it'll be 27 now that the UK has left. Yeah. Now, you will have the presentation of the case by the prosecution. You'll have the defense, and there are translation blocks. There are 24 official languages of the European Union. Those languages for which either the judge or either the prosecution or defense would need to know in order to proceed with the trial, those are the languages that are translated in real time. So, for example, let's say that we have an Austrian company and a Hungarian government, and those are the 2 parties, and the judges are from whatever 5 countries they're from. You might not have a Slovenian translator sitting there because there's none of the judges are from Slovenia, none of the parties are from Slovenia. It just doesn't make sense. But all of the information and data will be later translated into all of those languages for access in terms of reading the judge's decision, and judges with an S, right? Their decision.
And one other key piece is that where things get tricky is sort of when you get into the deep end of the pool. And let's use that analogy that we had, or that example we had of Richard taking my laptop. And let's say the EU, the Commission, and the EU legal structure, passed the law that said you can borrow someone's laptop, not steal it, as long as you are taking slides that are yours out of presentations that aren't authorized, right? So Richard could borrow my laptop in this case, take his slides out, and then hand me the slides back, i.e. this is sort of like a fake IP example. But let's say Dutch law treated Richard taking my laptop is stealing my laptop, period. Like that's how it's treated. It doesn't matter what his intent was, it's irrelevant. Well, if this was a case that was significant enough, there might be two aspects of this case. One, ruling that basically the law's already settled. Richard can do this across Europe. And two, the Netherlands is in violation of the European law that says you can take someone's laptop to take their slides off if there isn't a counterparty agreement in use. And then you'd have this either no collision or semi-collision, or the Dutch would just change the law. Or what you see is if it's a very unique and kind of extremely random case, they just ignore it. Yeah. Right. Everyone just sort of ignores it and just hopes it goes away.
The one point that I would make is, if we compare this to the American system, right, in the judges have the power of judicial review, and that the judges are able to make the law from the bench. The Court of Justice of the European Union cannot do that, but they can compel a member state to change its law in accordance with their decision. What that law actually looks like on the nation state level is entirely contingent on the nation state's government.
Yep. And the real hard challenge to this, fundamentally, I know we have a few minutes left, is that not always, but many times these laws are structured around critical or historically local conditions that made sense, in some cases still make sense. And there's almost this forced harmonization, sort of forced flattening, which I think, and not just the US as an example, many other places, Canada, Japan, it doesn't really matter, do have a lot of flexibility, right? So if you're dealing with a topographically challenged region, you're not going to try to impose certain legal standards that make sense in a extremely dense city, or vice versa. Right. And you see this all over the world. In many times, I would say pretty consistently, the goal is to flatten a lot of the European, let's say what they call missives, basically. Yeah, exactly. Dismissives and missives. So
the final institution we want to cover is the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank, actually, we have a question. Is this what's happening with Hungary refusing to take the European Union directed number of refugees, illegal aliens? There is a conflict. I would say that there is a conflict in that case between what the European Union is requiring and what Hungary is doing, but this is not going through the Court of Justice of the European Union.
That's right.
So this is primarily at the negotiation level, because the European Union hasn't passed a directive or a regulation requiring the intake of the refugees. So Hungary's action in opposition to the European Union stance is not a legal violation.
Yeah.
Right.
And also a great point you just made around the word directive, because there's not a constitutional system. They sort of built this.
Yeah, we're going to talk about directives next time we meet.
Yeah, exactly. Semi-constitutional, but I just want to throw that out there just so people can associate it. This semi-constitutional system, and what they do is they pass things called directives because they don't have that constitutional infrastructure. So. I mean, I actually believe what's going on there is happening at sort of two levels. One, there's a bunch of practical legal questions there enforcement protocols, et cetera. And then there's this sort of collision of nation state personalities, sort of, parties that is completely political. And the two are sort of have been so conjoined, and doesn't seem to be a mechanism for either side to try to sort of unlock themselves. And absolutely. I think you see this over and over again. It's sort of, this is the continuous crisis that you have with states, because you could argue there was a version of this with the Greek crisis, where basically the Germans through the EU and the ECB were forcing, and ultimately did, force the Greeks to drink a enormous bottle of Robitussin cough syrup, which is the American version of the brand, which I think is in parts of Europe now too. The last
anyway, let's finish this. Yes. So we've got the European Central Bank. Yep. And the European Central Bank is a financial entity that is organized according to the TFEU, and we'll talk much more about the TFEU next time, but that's sort of the reformulation of the Treaty of Rome. And their Article 127.1, giving it the primary duty of maintaining economic stability. The problem is, of course, that the European Union, in the TFEU and in assorted documents, never actually explained what that means. So the various agencies that have governed the European Central Bank have understood its role to generally support the economic policies of the European Union as sort of a larger mandate. And it's done things like try to keep the inflation rate consistent around 2%, because that apparently maintains stability. But since that term's never been defined, the ambit of the European Central Bank in terms of its ability to interact in the economy has only been determined by the actions it has taken in the past, right? Its authority is somewhat circumscribed, but not terribly. Now, the European Central Bank makes the European Commission look incredibly transparent in terms of its organization and development. The executive board is 6 people that are appointed directly by the European Council. So if we thought that the Council was itself difficult so the European Council, right, that was the one that sets up the long-term plans. So they meet 5 times a year and they appoint these people. How do they appoint them? Usually they happen to be high-ranking officials in either France or Germany. But these people are appointed, and then there's a governing council, which is made up of the executive board plus 19 other members, each being a minister from one of the countries that implements the euro. So that's why it's 19 instead of 27, right? Because it's not every EU member state. It's only the EU member states that have the euro. It's also important to note that there are 2 non-EU countries that use the euro. That's Montenegro and Kosovo. And those countries do not have representation in the European Central Bank.
And a couple of practical things. I know we're running up against the witching hour. Is and I guess I can open this for everybody. Ask all to unmute. There we go. Because if people have questions, we could maybe stay 5 extra minutes, Richard, just to, if there's questions. But a couple, and you guys just jump in, right? So we can make it more open. Is that the concept of the ECB and the European monetary structure is a completely Germanic, and I use that word not accidentally, kind of driven approach going back really 40 years. And so amongst all the other political institutions that are supposed to be at least sort of diffused across Europe, it's the one with the least diffusion, right? It's based in Frankfurt. It's basically a Frankfurt-based organization, and what gets weirder is that that the German central bank policy and the ECB policy were really one and the same until a few years ago, and then they just changed like on a Wednesday, and then on COVID it just sort of like became un-German. Yet it has all these Germans in it. And so it's this sort of very strange thing going on. right? Like imagine a bunch of French people in institutions being unadministrative around Napoleonic law, even though that's what has been 200 years of French administrative law. And there's a version of that going on right now, which is very strange. And it's obviously some of this had to do with opening up the ECB to be a tool to help during COVID. But even pre-COVID, as there would be challenges to debt to GDP ratios, the ECB would just not sort of show up to the meeting. And that became sort of a vote to do whatever you want. Now we get this collision, and I put this article in here from Political EU, and I'll put a couple in there, that there's basically a collision that's being generated now because I guess people are waking up or kind of gaining their fiscal, philosophical certitude that they want to draw another arbitrary line around 100% GDP to debt ratio now, which is going to completely target, of course, small states in Europe. And they're going to try to enforce this, which is really, I would argue, we're going to have a new crisis in the next 1 to 2 years. I would call it austerity 2.0. Yeah. And they're walking themselves right into this right now.
All right. So I guess to finish today, I figured sort of a joking song. For those of you who remember Schoolhouse Rock, this is, I guess, the European version. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as the commissioners will. Oh, now I'm stuck in a debate, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key commissioners continue debate. Ooh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the European Parliament, and they vote on me. If they vote yes, what happens? Then I go to the Council of Ministers, and the whole thing starts all over again. Oh, no. Oh, yes, I'm just a bill. And I'm only a bill. If they vote for me in central Brussels, well, then I'm off to the commission where I'll wait in a line. But it won't actually be that long since the commission originally proposed me to begin with, and so they'll just go along with it to make nice.
And for those of you that don't know that song, which comes out of PBS, sort of Sesame Street, that I put in there the YouTube sort of the history of that, which goes back to me being a little kid in the 70s. So yeah, and you in the 80s, 90s. Sorry. Oh God. And my favorite slide.
So you can see just how non-confusing this set of entities are. You can also see on the left-hand side a map of all the cities that are involved, right? You've got Luxembourg, Frankfurt, Brussels, Strasbourg. All right, so I guess this is where we're going to end it for today. And I think next time we're going to just go to the law. I think that'll be a really fun place to start. And there's already the meetup group has a link. If Aaron, if you could put that link in the chat.
Oh yes, I'll do that right
so
now.
That people can see where the meetup is and that they can sign up for that. It's going to be the 20th of February at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is 8 p.m. German time, if you're based in Europe. And
and a quick thing before we run, if there's any questions you want us to cover that we didn't today, you can just put the comments in the February 20th meetup, that I just posted right there. And I really want to thank all of you. And if anyone has anything to say, and hopefully this was beneficial and you're able to start to kind of navigate more of the EU world. And we really are thankful that you all are here, and hopefully everyone stays healthy. And enjoys getting into the weeds with the EU.
Yeah, so let's open up the floor. Is anybody want to ask any questions before we head out?
And y'all can unmute yourself if you do.
Well, I just want to thank Richard and Aaron as well from my side, and then don't forget this Tuesday, and we should maybe talk about this Tuesday presentation as well. So Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this Tuesday, I'm doing a presentation as part of my Middle Eastern history series. This is going to be the 23rd in that series. We're going to talk about medieval Armenia. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time with the wars between the Safavids and the Byzantines over Armenian territory. We're going to discuss the Bagratid Kingdom of Armenia, which survived for about 150, 200 years. We're going to then talk about the Cilician Kingdom of Armenia, which it was an ally of the Crusader states. And then we're going to move from that period on to the Ottoman Safavid conflicts and how that affected the Armenian population. And that's sort of where we're going to end it. This presentation will not cover the Armenian genocide and other 20th century and 21st century issues. But it will give you a very clear sense of what Armenia was doing throughout history, and we'll talk about different kings, different political situations. It's going to be a lot of fun. And of course, I always recommend my Middle Eastern history series. That's going to be every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. As we pointed out, the next in this European Union series is the 20th of February. The link again is in the comments. Zach, do you want to add anything else?
I just want to point out that on Saturdays, we do have a presentation on Roman empires. On Tuesdays, Richard does Middle Eastern. And every, once a month, we do European Union. But we do have an off topic, like next month, Richard is doing a collaborative presentation with Elisa on, if anybody's interested in ancient Egypt, Hyksos, yeah. And that would be what, 25th dynasty? I don't remember.
No, it's 15th. But basically the story of the Hyksos is that these are Levantine settlers that came from what's now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. They came down into Egypt, and at some point they managed to overthrow the Egyptian government. It's very difficult to understand how that happened. We have some ideas, but we don't have a clear evidence. But we also know that they ruled Egypt for about 100 years. So we have to talk about that story, about what did it look like for them to rule, and then what did it look like when what we now call the New Kingdom of Egypt, led by the 18th dynasty, threw them out. And that will be on the 10th of February.
Yep. And after that, if anybody has any questions, please do speak. I'll hold your peace forever, like kind of during the marriage. Otherwise, we will let everybody go. And
and one other quick thing, I put in the chat of some other news sources that you can read things on. Just go to the main pages for some of them, like Vox EU or political.eu. Which you can get quite a bit of good news on things that are, EU related.
Another thing I would add is that if you're looking for what European Union courts say or do, Curia, which is the European Union website for the Court of Justice of the European Union, is completely free and entirely accessible. And opinions are written in every official language of the EU, except sometimes they don't write them in Gaelic, Irish Gaelic. And some of the older ones aren't written in the newer accession languages. But if you speak English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, pretty much every decision is Portuguese. Pretty much every decision is written in a language you can understand as your native language. Whether you can understand the legalese is a different question, but it is in your language, and you can read more about some of these decisions, especially when in February, when we discuss more about those legal cases. You can actually read up on what the court decided and why. All right. So I guess we head out now.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening if you're in Europe, or in the US, Sunday late afternoon. And we really appreciate your time, and hopefully this provided some value to you in understanding what's going on in the world and in the EU.
Last thing is, guys, please go to our YouTube channel called History, Fitness, Investing, and those three together. and make comments if you liked, disliked, whatever. I mean, in this case, mostly liked the presentation.
No pressure.
No
Other-
pressure.
Zach, by the way, Zach is acting like a European commissioner. So his inner.
Well, they don't even show us the statistic
I
of
know.
dislikes. So
I know. I'm joking. I
It
was
doesn't
joking.
So we only see likes anyway. But
Yes.
I do appreciate subscribe to our channel, support our channel. We just want your likes and or comments, and do ask questions. Even if it's a question that you might have for us, or you want to clarify a comment, we do continually looking at YouTube channel and answer your questions, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Great job, Richard.
Thanks. You too, Aaron.
Yep. Bye-bye. See